Flash in the Dark, Chapter 42, Training. Barry, you have super speed. How can you possibly be late? Oliver asked, looking over at her as she pulled to a walk out, heading towards the warehouse. Barry shrugged as she hopped up onto what was probably once a loading dock. I guess the super tardiness kind of makes up for it. She grinned, and Oliver rolled his eyes. Before we get started, the name of the man we're looking for is Roy G. Bigelow, Oliver said. Barry's grin faltered slightly. How did you find that out? She asked a bit hesitantly. Oliver raised an eyebrow. Barry fidgeted. Guy's still alive, right? Oliver nodded, rolling his eyes. Yes, he's alive. There was a slightly awkward pause. Barry cleared her throat. How do we catch Bigelow out here? She asked, changing the subject with the subtlety of a brick to the face. Oliver shook his head. We don't. We're here to train. Oliver pointed out. Barry frowned. What, like Rocky? She asked. Oliver rolled his eyes. I read Iris's blog posts about the Flash, and I visited all the crime scenes you fought at, he stated. Barry's eyes widened. Do you ever sleep? She asked. Another eye roll. Last month you took on a man called Leonard Snart, he stated. Barry tensed and fidgeted, looking anywhere but at Oliver. We call him Captain Cold. Of course, she didn't tell Oliver that the reason they only called him that around Star Labs was because Barry still felt a twist in her heart whenever his name was mentioned. She still couldn't believe that the man she had fallen for so hard could be such a bad person. We can talk about you giving your villains silly code names later, Oliver said with a slight huff. It was Barry's turn to roll her eyes. What, like over coffee with Deathstroke and the Huntress? She asked. Oliver tensed, and Barry knew she'd touched a nerve, but couldn't tell which name had caused it. The point is that you engaged Snart on a commuter train, which he derailed. Oliver pointed out, like she didn't already know that, and have nightmares about not being able to save everyone of the passengers, even though she'd managed to save everyone on the night in question. Okay, I will admit, there was some damage, but there were no casualties. Thanks to Felicity, Cisco, and Caitlin. Barry wasn't sure Snart wouldn't have killed her, like he seemed to be planning to do until the team showed up. Oliver nodded. True. But I have a question, Barry. When you get to a crime scene, do you case every inch of the place? You could. You have the time. But you don't, do you? You just run in blind. There's a difference between having powers and having precision, Barry, he said, shaking his head slightly. Barry pouted slightly as she followed Oliver off the decrepit loading dock and into the overgrown grass that surrounded the building. Oliver led her over to his bike as he continued to speak. Living this life takes more than a mask, Barry. It takes discipline. And since you are just as stubborn as I am, if not worse... What is that for? Barry interrupted as Oliver pulled his bow off the handles of his bike and grabbed an arrow out of a quiver on the ground. Oliver's lip tilted up in something of a smile. You're going to run over there, he said, pointing to a small hill about 16 feet away. You're going to come back at me, and you're going to get hit with an arrow. No, I'm not, Barry grinned. Oliver's grin was wider now. Yes, you are, he stated. Barry shook her head. Okay, I'll humor you. Barry zipped over to the top of the hill faster than Oliver could track. She stopped at the top of the hill and cupped her hands around her mouth. You ready? She called over to him, just audible from this distance. Oliver pulled back the string on his bow and nodded. Barry raced over to the same spot she'd been standing before and caught the arrow he fired inches from her forehead. Oliver pressed a button on his bow, and the crossbows hidden in the bushes behind Barry released, bolts flying into Barry's shoulder blades and burying themselves there. Barry screamed, her back arching. It was in this moment that, as Barry tried to see the bolts sticking out of her back, that it occurred to her that both of her most recent lovers had now shot her. How had this become her life? You shot me? She gasped. Oliver nodded and walked over to her. I heard you heal fast. He pulled both bolts out at the same time, making Barry scream again. Not that fast, you asshole! She shouted at him. Oliver frowned. How fast do you heal? He asked. Barry winced. Not instantly. I'd say about 20 times faster than a normal human. give or take. It depends on the injury, she explained, feeling blood drip down her back. Oliver felt a twinge of guilt. In that case, you should get those checked out, he pointed out. Barry glared at him. You think? She raced off to Star Labs. Felicity helped Barry to her feet, feeling something warm and wet on Barry's back. The blonde swore. Oh my god, he did the thing with the arrows, she gasped. Barry looked up at Felicity, hurt and a touch of betrayal in her eyes. You knew he was gonna shoot me? Barry demanded. Felicity helped Barry into the cortex. It is practically impossible to tell when he is joking, Felicity insisted. Caitlin rushed over to them and helped Barry onto the table and out of her shirt. Caitlin frowned, placing another strip of medical adhesive across Barry's cut. Dr. Wells was sitting in the corner, looking like he was resisting saying, I told you so. Cisco was chewing on a piece of licorice. Barry had called in an anonymous tip as to the name of their bad guy of the week about 5 minutes after she'd arrived at Star Labs. Joe entered the cortex and paused, looking first at his daughter's blood-stained shirt on the table next to the medical equipment Caitlin had laid out. Dr. Wells wheeled over to him. Detective, how can we help you? He asked. Joe frowned. I was looking for Barry. What happened here? The detective asked. Barry sighed. I don't want to talk about it. She glowered at the floor. Joe's frown deepened. All right, fine. I need to talk to you when you have a minute, Barry. Joe insisted. Caitlin finished patching her up and handed her a fresh Star Labs t-shirt. Barry followed Joe out of the cortex. What is it, Joe? She asked. Eddie made his case for the task force again, he stated. I thought Captain Singh already shot him down. She frowned. Joe nodded. He did. And Eddie probably would have left it alone, but you neglected to mention that you got Bigelow's name by shooting that storage guy in the leg, Joe said, looking pointedly at her. Barry froze. Technically, I didn't shoot him, she managed. Joe shook his head. How would you say you got that information then? 'Cause I'm gonna go with torture, Joe stated darkly. Barry sighed. The arrow gets results, Barry pointed out. Joe raised his voice slightly. He's a crazy man, Joe hissed. Barry nodded. Don't actually disagree with you right now, but we wouldn't even have Bigelow's name without him. So maybe you should judge him a bit less and just say thank you, Barry insisted. Joe shook his head. 2 things I will not be doing in this life: playing professional baseball and thanking that lunatic. Joe deadpanned. There was a ping over the intercom system. Barry, get in here. We got a ping from the facial recognition software, Cisco called. Barry zipped back into the cortex. Since when do we have facial recognition software? She asked. Felicity waved from one of the consoles. Happy Hanukkah. Where do I find him? Barry grinned slightly. Cisco tapped a few keys. Traffic cameras caught him entering a residence at 186 Jarvis, the engineer said, tapping the screen in front of him. Felicity went to pull out her phone. We should let the arrow know, the blonde said, and Barry shook her head. I can handle this. I've done this kind of a thing before, Felicity. I really don't feel like getting an arrow in the back again. I don't need his help. Barry zipped into her costume, then out of Star Labs and off towards Bigelow's location.